We're live.
All right, thank you. All right, so I would like to call to order the February 25th, 2021 Policy and Education Subcommittee meeting at 4:09. So I'm assuming since we have Dr. Scully here, we'll probably want to take these items out of order.
That'd be great.
So would you, I'll turn it to you, Dr. Hackett, in terms of if you want to introduce the topic.
Sure. So thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. As you remember, hopefully, I think I barely remember, it felt like 2 weeks ago, but we did meet on Monday night as a school committee, and in front of the school committee for the first time was the recommended program of studies for 21-22 school year. Dr. Scully provided a one-page overview, which is, I think, really the kind of the key document in this is generally what we do. The program of studies stays the same other than what is recommended on the summary document. And there were a few things on there. So I think the school committee will have a second reading of that. The school committee does not meet next week, but they will be meeting on the 8th. And the process is a little different, only in that we normally would have brought that to you first, but just the dates didn't work out. So to have you have a chance to ask any questions you might have. I think if Dr. Scully could just do, again, kind of the high level overview of it, and then any questions and conversation around it. And then hopefully you could be willing to recommend it for approval at the school committee at their next meeting. Dr. Scully.
Absolutely. Thank you. Hello again, everybody. So there's a number of items on here, and as Dr. Hackett points out, the vast majority of the program of studies remains the same. And then I would say on these changes, probably half of them fall in the category of housekeeping, and then a couple of the others are a little bit more substantial. So I'll just reiterate each of the points. The first one about a competency determination language. This has to get done every couple of years. You know, we go from one test to another test. We go from one grading scale to another grading scale. This year, the issue would be there's been a number of waivers that the DESE has granted to either the class of 2021 or, in the case of science, the class of 21, 22, and 23, all of whom can pass a course in high school rather than, rather than pass that test. So we'll just update the language to reflect that. That's an area that we usually have to look at every couple of years anyhow. Second one was the sequence of science courses. Currently, ninth graders who take level 1 or level 2 classes, so either at the advanced honors or honors level, take biology, and ninth graders at the level 3 level take an introductory physics class. So for a number of reasons, and after doing research with schools, comparable academically strong schools across the state, we found that there is no full agreement. The state gives tests for different subjects, so there is some flexibility in that. And we came to the conclusion, working with Dr. Clifford and working with the guidance department and working with the building administration here, that having all students by grade together on the same course made more sense for us to be able to support them, particularly speaking to the English learner department and the special education department, both of whom thought this would be a nice way to align their supports as well. I'll just run through all of them and then we can take questions at the end if that makes sense, Dr. Hackett. Okay. The next one is the elimination of additional lab periods for non-AP science courses. What that means is that AP science courses have double lab blocks where they meet in, it looks like they meet in the course and then for a lab, but the point is the teachers can use that as an extended, under a regular schedule, between 110 and 120 minute block to do more in-depth labs. The other science classes that have labs, students have a lab period, which meets usually in a period where they have physical education and sits out there as an extra block. We're advocating, and we proposed here, the elimination of that period. It would mean a slight reduction in time for science courses. It should be noted that it's the only department that has that extra block. And it doesn't mean that we're eliminating labs. Because the labs fit in that additional block, they fit in the regular block that we have. So we still anticipate sort of having lab activity all the way through for all courses. It's just that that activity would be subsumed by the actual course, not by the additional lab period. We would adjust the credits for each of those courses because those courses carry 6 credits. We would adjust those back to 5 to reflect the amount of time that they actually meet. And as a result of that, we would adjust the number of credits needed to graduate because those courses would now be 5 instead of 6. Students would still take the same number of courses, the same number of lab science courses. It's just more a mathematical adjustment because those lab courses would be worth 5 instead of 6 credits. The last couple of points, math course, Math Foundations. This really is an attempt to address gaps for students who might have an untraditional path to Braintree High School. So students who join us as transfer students, SLIFE students who are English learners whose formal education has been interrupted in their home country, students with gaps of those variety would be placed in this course, Math Foundations. It really would be as personalized as possible. I've talked to Ms. Miller about it at length. It seems like a great idea because right now a student with a gap is basically placed in a course relative to their year in school, which may not really be addressing the gaps that they have. This would allow a math instructor to work with that student intensely, get them up to speed, and then potentially even within the same year, they could re-enter the math sequence that we have. Next item is the listing of a pilot world language elective. It would just be a half-year elective, Introduction to Latin in the Roman World. Our world language department has 2 courses. I know if you talk to Ms. Ward, I think she would like to have 7 different languages probably that she would offer. But this is one step in that direction. And as an elective, it would be both, it would focus both on language and on culture and history. So could be potentially enjoyed by students in that way. The next 4 fall under that housekeeping category. We have not run level 4 courses for longer than I've been at BHS. The proposal is to drop that designation. There are a couple business courses which are being dropped, and I believe part of the discussion Monday night was this is not a reflection on their worth. It's just the fact that they have not run in multiple years. And we do have, for instance, when it comes to Introduction to Occupations, students in the LECE program have an entire course on college and career readiness. So we do feel like we are getting those opportunities and that support to students. They're not interested in those courses. We'd like to eliminate those from the program of study. The question of why not just leave them there is because what happens is, when I spoke to Mr. Garofalo, he said each year you'll have 3 or 4 students who would sign up for Introduction to Occupations. Then the course doesn't run when we build the schedule. Now those students are forced to sort of go back, even if they've chosen an alternative, they have to relook at their schedule, what has run, and sometimes they're not able to get into an elective because of that. So it's a little bit misleading to students who are picking their own schedules. The other one that falls in this category is Geometry 3B. Currently so for geometry and a couple of the math courses, they have level 1, 2, 3A, and 3B. This year, we're not running 3B as a pilot. By all accounts, it's worked out very well. They have the same curriculum. They cover the same standards. And we feel that sort of by loosening up the distinction, we're able to have schedule sections that have more natural proportions of those learners mixed in. It's easier for teachers to have model students in those classes, and it reduces class size a little bit. So we feel like the students are better served in this way. And then finally, as always, even though you think a document is done, you reread it and you say, how did I leave that comma there or not put that period there? And so there are editorial changes all the way through.
Thank you, Dr. Scully.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions, but I'll turn to my fellow subcommittee members first, if you guys have any questions.
I'm all set, Madam Chair. Thank you.
All right. Nothing from Mr. Chief, I take it. So
I'm all set, thanks.
okay. Okay, so could you talk a little bit more, Dr. Scully, about the lab stuff? So we heard a comment during public comment in the last school committee meeting with some concerns around that. So
Sure.
From what you said, it sounds like, or did I understand that the lab activities can take place in the normal course, or is it sort of going away, that extra lab period?
Yeah, so let me explain a little bit of how it works now. If I'm a student in a science course, we can take, they function slightly differently for the different courses because of how the levels are blended. But if I'm in a science course, I meet, well, maybe I shouldn't use this year as an example. And if this were a normal year, um, I'll meet 6 times in my class in a regular cycle. Um, I have a lab period that meets during a different block. And in that block, because of how it's scheduled, I'm mixed in with students from other courses, excuse me, from other sections. And I'll also have a teacher that may or may not be my own teacher. So that's fine. We have great science teams. They fit together, they work together really well. They keep all their students together as they work through the year with the object of making sure that they are all at the same place. So when the lab comes up, they can go to a different teacher with a different group of students and take that lab period and do that activity. So what we would be doing would be eliminating that period, which, as I mentioned, would be a net loss of some time. We acknowledge that. But what it would do is, since the labs are taking place just in that one period, that period is the same length as my regular biology or my regular chemistry class. So if it's a lab that fits within 58 minutes, then I can do that in the 58 minutes with my class. Personally, I think it also makes it a little bit easier to sort of have an activity that might spill over or might be set up the day before, and then you run the activity the next day, because I'm working directly with my teacher and my teacher can manage that process. So we definitely would still be keeping lab activities. Students would be learning not only those skills based around inquiry, but also sort of fundamental lab skills in terms of safety and some basic techniques that they need. Students who pursue science at the higher levels and take an AP course still will have that double lab period. Those are scheduled back to back, same teacher. Let's say they run, third period and fourth period on a given day. So they just work right through the bell. They gain not only the double time, but also the passing time in theory, depending on how the activity goes. Those remain intact for all the AP science courses. It's just for these normal courses where we would subsume that back within the regular course of the class itself. I guess sort of for broader context as well, one of the difficulties of having a lab period that works that way is that we now need to find a block for students where they can have not just their science class, but they need to have this other lab period scheduled into their day. And what happens is we only have so many resources as a school in terms of classrooms, in terms of teachers. What happens is that puts pressure on their schedule. And so there will be times, and I spoke to Mr. Garofalo about this today just to make sure I had the mechanism right. There are times when, because of where that lab has to fit, that student's block is now taken up with the lab. We can always put them in a phys ed there, but they may not be able to take an elective or a different course that they were looking for that meets in their other period, because we can't swap that out with the lab block. So that's a little bit of like I realize that's a little bit of arcana for how the schedule is built, but suffice it to say, it puts significant pressure on the schedule. And I know that every spring, Mr. Garofalo and Mr. Dellery work extra hard trying to figure these labs out, and it results in students having less than optimal schedules. So that would be one of the things that are gained. We do lose a little bit of time, which is why we would adjust the credits, but it's not that we're getting rid of lab activity. We're subsuming it back within the course itself.
Okay. And I assume this was approved by our esteemed science director when you made this change.
Yes. So it's something that we've talked about, and sort of it's come up both through the scheduling process and just in conversations. Really, and Mr. Lee can probably talk about the longer history of it if this meeting was going to go for a couple more hours.
Yeah,
But suffice it to say, I spoke with Dr. Clifford even from the first time that I showed up here. We knew that this was an issue about how it was handled. I think probably clear from the public input that sort of people can have different opinions about it. And I think people do. I think sort of it's difficult when, it appears on paper a loss of time. I don't think it's a complete loss of, 16% or whatever it would be because that course is an additional meeting. Because I do think that there's some efficiencies that'll be gained by having students stay with their own teachers all the way through both the recitation part of class and the lab part of class.
All right. Thank you for that thorough explanation.
And I'll just give you just a really brief amount of history because you've seen this before.
Right.
It was a number of years ago. We came to the committee looking to make changes to the labs because in the broader schedule that allowed for a better balance of students and for more equitable class sizes regardless of the subject matter. And a lot of that relates to what Dr. Scully explained in terms of how that one odd block really does impact a lot of the scheduling opportunities for students and staff. So this has been a conversation that's been ongoing for at least my entire time here. You know, as he mentioned earlier, science had more time in a given course than all other courses. And so although it is a loss for them and they make wonderful use of the time, it is bringing it back in line with what other courses have for time during the course of the year. It has some added benefits around the schedule and some other pieces as well.
Great, thank you.
And let me just add one last point as well. Sort of what Jim mentioned made me think of this as well, is that by basically taking off of the teacher schedules those lab periods, we'll also free up more sections for the actual science courses. And so our class sizes in science classes, it's not a perfect one-to-one correspondence, but class sizes will go down. And so we think that's also a benefit to the instruction in the actual courses as well.
My other question was around the world language. So I took Latin for 4 years at a high school down the street here in Braintree, not Braintree High, but so I'm definitely all for Latin. I think it's great. One thing that we've heard from parents before, and I've mentioned this to you before, Dr. Scully, so it's old news, is an interest in ASL. So I wonder, has that ever, I know it's maybe not a world language, I don't really know. Has that ever come up in conversation in terms of additional languages we could offer?
It has, and I've had some preliminary conversations with Ms. Ward about it. There's always a challenge with expanding languages, and some on the call know that I formerly was a language teacher. And the challenge is sort of, it's kind of an all or nothing approach sometimes. That's what it feels like. Now, it doesn't have to be, but the challenge would be if we were to introduce a non-Romance language, then you need to find an instructor who can sort of immediately pick up 5 of those sections because you're less likely to have overlap. So I'd be very much interested in offering an ASL class. I think the challenge for us is to identify somebody that we have on staff who A, has the room in their schedule to offer it as an additional section, but then B, you know, also is, say, a language teacher who has ASL, or one possibility, and this is where I think sort of as we move into next year and sort of hopefully we have a little bit more regularity, we can perhaps look a little bit more broadly to the throughout the faculty. So one answer, and I will admit that I haven't made a thorough search of this yet, would be there may be an instructor in a different department who has that skill. We could pursue, you know, teaching it as one course. It may even be possible to teach off license depending on how the rest of their schedule worked out, or if it ran as a semester or something like that. So it's a little bit of getting the capacity in terms of our staff, and then also making sure that we have the overlap, because I think it's very difficult to you know, put out a posting and find somebody willing to come by and teach one section, particularly when our regular schedule, they need to be available at 7:30 Monday, 8:30 Tuesday, 9:30 Wednesday. But I do think that's a great idea. I would love to offer a class like that. I think we would get enrollment fairly quickly. So it's a question of staffing, and we can certainly look at that for the next cycle going through.
Yeah, I think that would be great, just based on the public feedback that we've heard.
Okay.
That was all my questions. Thank you. So it sounds like, actually, I don't know what it sounds like. Do we need to make a motion to bring this back to the school committee for approval then?
I think you could make a motion that you would recommend it for approval, to support, you know, the document itself.
Okay. I will make that motion to bring this to the full school committee. Anyone willing to second?
I'll second that.
All right, we'll do a roll call vote. Mr. Devon,
Aye.
Mr. Chafe?
Aye.
And I vote aye. So thank you very much for the overview, and we will catch you on March 8th, maybe?
Yeah, very much looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Dr. Scully.
All right. Unless anyone else has a preference, I'll just head back to the top of the list and go from there.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so hopefully everyone has had a chance to take a look at the minutes from the January 14th meeting. If there are no questions or concerns, I would love to entertain a motion to approve.
I can make the motion, but I can't vote on it because I have to abstain because I wasn't there.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
The motion to pass.
I'll second it. So we'll do a roll call vote. So I'll call on you, Mr. Devon, just for your official abstention. Mr. Devon,
Abstention, please. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Chafe,
Aye.
and I vote aye. So these minutes are approved. Rocking right along. We'll go back to the review of the table policy, CHCA approval of handbooks. So this was brought up by Mr. Kokoris in our last school committee meeting regarding the language around the superintendent using their judgment as to whether other specific handbooks need committee approval. And that all handbooks published would be made available to the committee for informational purposes. I'm okay with striking the language around using the judgment and the fact that all of them have to come through us. I don't necessarily share the same concern, but since we don't know who our superintendent will be, maybe we should center on getting them all coming past us.
I feel like that was too soon.
Well,
Is this going to be the?
if it was going to be you, I'd say, we don't. It's fine.
I would just say that I certainly have no problem. I would have said that the other night, but I couldn't get it out fast enough.
Yeah.
I think that, part of it comes down to the definition of what a handbook is. I think that the policy would contemplate things like a professional development handbook for teachers. It wouldn't really necessarily need, or would the school committee want to, but I think striking the language altogether is certainly fine.
Yeah. Okay. And I would imagine that's a conversation that can be had with the chair, should we bring this or not, or with this committee, and then we can figure it out.
For clarifying, do you mean you as the chairperson of this committee or the greater school committee?
I was thinking the greater school committee chair.
Oh, wow.
And in the course of developing the agenda for the meeting,
Right.
that might be something that comes up.
Okay, so I mean, if we strike that shall we say statement whereby let's see, if we just go with all handbooks will be published and will be made available to the committee for informational purposes, I think, we just take that other line right out, and I think we're all set.
I agree.
Okay, I'll make a motion that we approve and bring forth to the greater school committee that amended policy of approval of handbooks.
Great. I'll second it. We'll do a roll call vote. Mr. Devon,
Aye.
Mr. Chafe,
Aye.
and I vote aye. So we will bring that to the next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're rocking right through this thing. So the next thing is the consideration of next year's school calendar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me see if I can easily pull this up here, but I'm sure I'm not going to be able to. Got it. Just
Okay, I was going to say I can share if you need me to.
Just like that.
Yep. Okay, let me just share this real quick. So you do have this in your packet. This would be still considered a first reading even by this committee. We would bring it to the school committee at the March 8th meeting for a first reading and then eventual approval. As we talked about this calendar going into next year, clearly there are some unknowns, but I think all of us are, and I think statewide, the mindset is we will be back to full in person. The questions around things like is the state going to continue to authorize students to do full remote learning? Still remain to be answered. And not that this is the meeting for that discussion right now, but from a resource standpoint, that would be a challenge for us. So I think as we, kind of move through the rest of the spring and have those discussions around what the program will look like, that will certainly be a topic of conversation. So what we thought was important, though, was to give ourselves a little bit more time in opening the school year for next year. As you know, the way that school year ended last year, the way that it started this year, we were really unable to do a lot of the things that we would normally do, like student orientations. We have a brand new middle school that we haven't even cut a ribbon on yet. So we really feel like that week, which is normally we would just maybe have a workshop day, or maybe we'd start a school, one of those 2 days, like Wednesday or Thursday. We feel like that week, leaving it empty for allowing for us to transition students and provide good orientations for kids, chances for kids to walk through buildings, that kind of thing would be, I think, advantageous to the children and to families, because it really would be the first time next year where families will be kind of, parents will be allowed back kind of into our buildings. We've also been missing that piece all year long. So I just think it's a good week to kind of do some of those kinds of orientations. The 6th is Labor Day. We would do our workshop day, our normal beginning of the year workshop day on the 7th. And then the first day of students grades 1 through 12 would be on the 8th. Kindergarten story hour. I do need to check with the principals a little bit more on that, but we have slated it here for the 8th as well. Normally that's like the day after, but we'll be starting a little bit late. So it'd be good, I think, to get that in a little earlier. And then the first day for kindergartners and preschool will be the 9th. We would have a half-day workshop on the 28th. And then, I think for the most part, it's pretty much a standard, very familiar calendar. We do have the election day on November 2nd, which is traditionally, historically, we've taken off because just the amount of traffic that we see in our buildings. I know the council is contemplating whether or not they are going to reduce the number of polling stations, but they have not made a decision on that. I don't know what a potential timeline would be on that. And I still, even then, I don't know that it would impact how we treat election days, even though it will be in 3 of our buildings instead of all of our buildings. But if that does happen, we may come back to you and say, we'd like to think about this a little differently.
Excuse me, Doctor.
Yes, sir.
Would we have any say in that, or is it they just telling us what we're gonna do?
Well, they basically are deciding from using most all of our schools, not every school, as you know, is a polling station, to using 3. I was asked to attend the council meeting. I did not speak, but I had provided just the opinion that for us, logistically, it would be easier if not every one of our schools was used, and that we have had some minor little accidents actually in some of our Morrison, I think for the first year I got here, that our schools, especially the elementary schools with Morrison, one road in, one road out, is just not very advantageous to have voting there. And we certainly could not have school at the same time. So I think it'd be certainly better for kids, if and safer for everybody if they reduce the number of schools that they use for polling.
Yeah, the question is, do we vote on this? I mean, I understand what you're saying.
Yep.
And I agree, the polling places should be in some of these schools.
Right.
But I mean, there are other places that they could move them to.
Right.
I'm just wondering, is it what they say is what we have to abide by? Or do we take a vote and decide to agree or disagree?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't know what the history, maybe one of you knows the history of voting within the schools. I'm imagining it goes back a long ways, and I don't know whether the original decision was subject to a school committee vote or whether it just kind of happened.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Please.
Okay. In talking with the town clerk, and from what I remember, and I do remember back when the old Lincoln School was there, and it was a polling place. And the world we lived in back then is far different than it is now. And with security and safety being, something at the forefront of what we're doing now. In talking with Jim Casey and others, what they're looking to do is go with, South Jute Middle School, East Middle School, in the high school. And that type of a situation kind of, we're able to, shall we say, control the campuses for the elementary schools. I think it's a pretty good trade for us. And maybe at some time in the future, we would, figure out, do we go with one gym at the east and one gym at the south? So, and do we have to shut the place down or don't we? Do we get police patrols and things such as that? I mean, that's something that's kind of up in the air. I just see it as them now trying to reduce the exposure in our elementary schools. And that's one of the things they asked me what my opinion was. And I mean, anytime we can lessen exposure in elementary schools, I'm willing to listen. Do I think it's a situation where, they vote, we just, obey? I'd like to think we're going to have a better dialogue than that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. I know this was discussed at the town council meeting, but I did not follow up after to see where it ended up. Does anyone happen to know if they are intending to take a vote on the 6 versus 3 versus 1 that they were talking about?
If I'm being honest, Madam Chair, that conversation really went an awfully long time, and I may or may not have lost connection to the
I
meeting.
see.
I wasn't able to stay to the conclusion, but I can double back and find out where it left off.
And I can do the same, just as easily, but I looked through the PowerPoint beforehand, but, never ended up following up to see where it ended up. Okay, so I can do that, and then, we'll figure out, to Mr. Chafe's point, what the implications are and go from there.
Okay. I will point out one thing in particular. The state has adopted Juneteenth, which is the recognition of the late emancipation of slaves, I believe, in Texas. I don't have a good grasp of the history of it, but as a state holiday, where it falls in the calendar on the 20th, we would recognize it along with the rest of the state as a state holiday. That is the recommendation, not even the recommendation. Obviously we do recognize state holidays, so we would fall in line with that in this calendar. So that really is the only other major or difference between what you're looking at here and what we would normally do. I also would just add that it's not clear whether or not the state's going to continue to allow snow days to be made up through remote learning. My guess is that they are going to try to get as far away from anything like that as they can. That was the intention of the plan for going into this year, which obviously things change, but I do not think that they're probably going to allow that anymore. So we have built in the snow days, 5 snow days as backup.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you read my mind. I wondered if my friends, the blizzard bags, would still be on the table, but I agree that that's probably not likely. Any other questions or comments about the calendar? So like Dr. Hackett said, we'll consider this a first reading. We get a chance to absorb it and come up with any other questions at our next meeting then. Okay. Thank you. So we will move on to the next item, the distribution and first reading of the special education early report.
So thank you, Madam Chair. So the early report was actually commissioned, so to speak, by us. We, as part of trying to really have an outside look at our special education programming, which while the state does provide, a review process that happens, it was, we were very interested in asking some very specific questions and having our staff interviewed about how we're delivering program, about how we're communicating that, about staffing itself. There have been, the paperwork around special education, the requirements that we have to meet. There have been some discussions with teachers during the course of the last round of negotiations for the current master contract that we, together kind of look and see whether or not there were some solutions to try to figure out some of the challenges we face. So the early report was actually completed just prior to in draft form, just prior to us shutting school down. Then we were off and running, and just didn't, there was really not been a good time to get back to it. I think this is a good time to get back to it, as part of even potentially the budget conversations, because there potentially could be some, there are recommendations that would have budget implications. But I think it's what's really important for everyone to know. This is not a binding report. This is a report that we asked for because we're trying to get better. And, I can already tell you that there's some things we agree with, and there's some things that we don't agree with. There's some things that we believe would be very difficult to even implement and maybe not worth it. But there are also things in there that we, that I think we certainly can learn from. So I will distribute that to you in hard copy to your homes because it's fairly big. I'll also send to you digitally, but all I wanted to do tonight was just introduce to you the fact that that report is now considered to be complete, and that we will like to, at your next meeting potentially, or even the meeting after that, come to you with some of our thoughts and recommendations on how to proceed with it. What we're looking to do is create essentially kind of a multi-year plan, administrative action plan, to address the recommendations, those recommendations anyway, that we think would be worth addressing. So it's certainly not something we would be implementing all of next year, even with all the recommendations that we agree with. It is definitely a multi-year process, and that's the point. So we will come back to you with that for discussion, and I think that could be potentially a decent chunk of a next meeting, so at a lighter agenda, and then eventually we'll bring it to the full school committee through you as a policy group.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, that was going to be my question, which you've already answered. Would it come to us first and then to the full committee, or straight on? So, okay, so we'll look forward to receiving that and taking a look and then having that conversation.
Okay.
The next item on the agenda was actually raised to us from some parents. We received a handful of emails regarding the school year 2021 MCAS. There's a resolution that was floated by the MASC, so the governing body over school committees. They provided sort of a boilerplate resolution that was approved by their board of directors at one of their meetings, actually back in the fall. And the content of the resolution was included in our packet. It basically has two main points, if I can sum it up. One is graduation year 2022 who missed their 10th grade MCAS not be required to make it up during this school year. And then the other part of it is a moratorium on all high stakes testing for this school year, so that students can benefit from their time being focused on direct instruction. So, I feel like this falls pretty squarely within policy to bring up as a discussion. What I would like to do, if the rest of the committee agrees, is I actually think we would benefit, and it would be the right thing to do for us to bring this to the full school committee for discussion. Of course we can discuss it here if folks want, but I feel like it's a discussion that would be beneficial to have in public and for the whole school committee to participate in it. So I'm interested in any thoughts from anybody else here,
Madam Chair, if I may.
please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's a healthy conversation. I don't think, unless you're living on Mars, this year has been so different and so out of the realm of anything we thought could ever happen, that this type of a discussion can't help but, shall we say, shed light on the enormity of how things have been just thrown off kilter. I would like to hear other people's opinions, both for and against, and obviously it's non-binding. So whatever comes of it, just comes of it. But the discussion being out in the light of day is a positive, no matter what we come up with as an opinion. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. I think, like I said, it's beneficial for us to discuss in public. A number of other towns have passed it as a resolution. And like you said, it is just that. It's the school committee, taking a stance on it, if it passes or not, which is also a stance unto itself. So any other comments or questions?
No, through you, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to have a full committee discuss this. I believe we need to do this testing to see where the kids are. I mean, they're missing almost 2 years worth of in-school learning. Maybe we could try and get a waiver from the Department of Education where if we're doing badly, it won't harm our kids. But we need to see where these kids are and where we're failing, and if we're failing, and if we're not, what our strong suits are. I believe we need some standardized testing on this. We need to see what's being taught, what the kids are getting out of this. So I have no problem with bringing it to the full board.
Okay, great. I mean, and you know, I've said before that I believe teachers are the best judge of that, of how much the students have learned and where they are. So exactly to your point, Mr. Chafe, I think we can have a healthy discussion of this at our full school committee meeting. And there is also the factor that the president has said these tests will go on. So
Madam Chair,
we're discussing. Yeah.
if I could follow up on that heavy sigh. Just, you know, I would just add a couple of things. One, I think that having some kind of measure that demonstrates for us and other school systems kind of where we all are in comparison to each other is important. I will say that, you know, there's just no doubt that there's going to be some heavy statistical challenges for the state in terms of how they measure performance. And, you know, to make it meaningful, they're going to have to probably make some adjustments in terms of how they actually do the overall, the statistical analysis of it and the reporting of it. I would imagine that they would be planning to make some adjustments to it. I will say from a logistical standpoint, and this is separate and apart from the discussion about whether or not we think that it should be done or not, or whether we believe in testing, high stakes testing, or whatever. I happen to, unfortunately, as their superintendent, I don't know. I do think that, I don't know about high stakes, but I do think that assessments are important. I agree with what you said, Madam Chair, about, you know, certainly we can develop, and we have developed our own local assessments, which is really, in some ways, more important because it's really measuring what we're teaching. But I do think there has to be something that shows some kind of comparison. I do think that the MCAS traditionally has been just way too long. And I do think too high stakes from a certain standpoint. But I logistically, this is a heavy lift. I mean, we're you know, clearly we're talking about kids who are trying to administer the test itself. There's also the expectation that we are going to administer, and kids who are in full remote are going to take the MCAS test. So we've already had some, Rebecca Kidwell is Director of Accountability and Technology, and Mr. Lee out of his office, and the directors, and even with the principals, we've had some conversations about how do we do this logistically. You know, we'll be ready to go, but it's not going to be easy. And my concern related to that is that it is going to take, you know, it's going to take instructional time. So, and that's something that I think we have, we hold at a premium in any regular year. Certainly since the pandemic, I think we hold it even more of a premium. So we may be able to help contribute to the conversation at the school committee level by having maybe Rebecca or Mr. Lee speak to logistically how are we planning to do it.
I think that would be great. I'd love to hear from all of you on the topic.
Thank you.
So
Sorry,
Madam,
Jim.
are you willing to entertain a motion that we bring this forward to the greater commission, greater committee in order to stimulate conversation at the larger committee?
Please.
I'll make that motion, please.
Okay, I'll second it. So we'll do our roll call. Mr. Devon,
Aye.
Mr. Chafe,
Uh,
and I will also vote aye. So we will look forward to a spirited conversation about this at our next meeting, if we're able to. I have to be the jerk in the room and say that unless we think we can cover this in just a few minutes, we might have to table the rest of these policies for the next meeting, because I do, as I said, have a work-related thing that I have to jump on.
There's nothing here that's urgent, Madam
Madam
Chair.
Chair, I'll make a motion to table the remainder of our itinerary.
Okay, thank you. I do want to mention one other thing. I heard from our Director of Music, Mr. Sawtell, about another resolution that is floating around some towns related to singing, which is interesting. I looked at it very briefly, but I would like to, and I can do this in writing, request that that also be placed on the agenda for our discussion. I looked at what he sent very quickly, but in our next meeting, I can provide some materials and whatever I can find about it for us to also discuss that.
That'd be good. He's thumped on me about it too.
So that would be something
Okay.
that's almost like new business.
Yeah, exactly.
Madam Chair, one other thing I'd like to put on new business is our constructive possession policy. I know it's going to take a long time. It's not something that's going to handle in 1 or 2 readings. It's another quote unquote hot button issue, but I know it's going to come up at obviously, when you feel it's the best time, but I would like to let people know that we are willing to look at that.
Okay, let's put it on the agenda for the next meeting. If you could provide some background as to where sort of the interest is coming from. It just isn't something that I've heard, which doesn't mean it's not out
I
there.
can provide that as well, Madam Chair.
Okay, perfect.
I have had an experience with it that it does need review.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, if you guys can be obviously prepared to give a little bit of background on that as context, that would be very helpful. So I suppose we can convene offline in terms of looking at our next date. Maybe we can shoot for something next week,
Yeah, I think
if
that
that's okay, because it gets us ready for the school committee meeting on the following Monday.
sounds good.
Okay.
Right.
Any other questions or concerns?
I'll put some dates and times out.
Okay, thank you. I'd love to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second,
Thank you. Roll call vote, Mr. Devon,
Aye.
Mr. Chafe,
aye.
and I also vote aye. So our meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Good night.
Take care.
It was nice talking to you, Jim.